Hello, everyone. Welcome to the webinar on remote leadership is not an oxymoron. Thank you, all of those, for joining in. We've got quite a few people still coming in right now. I can see joining the room. So we'll give it just another 10 to 15 seconds. We'll let people get settled in. I'm sure just like everybody else in this world, especially if you're on this webinar, you probably are leading remote teams, or maybe you're running in a remote infrastructure. And one meeting does not ever end a minute early. Meeting it ends a minute late. So as people are wrapping up their last meetings and coming into this one, we'll get started. I can see we already have a fairly diverse geographic spread here. We've got kind of both coasts covered with Idaho, and then we got the middle with North Dakota with Dan. We got Dean coming in from London. We got the East Coast covered by Patty. Some more in the middle there with Barry, or with Matt, I should say. Awesome. All right. Well, we're going to get started. We do have quite a few people still coming in, but I want to make sure we have time to go through the entire webinar today. Again, thank you for joining this great webinar we have in store for us today on remote leadership is not an oxymoron. For those of you who are not familiar, this is the Microsoft Teams webinar platform. As you can see, people are already leveraging the chat. We really encourage you to use that chat to either chat with each other, chat with me. There's also a Q&A tab that you're welcome to ask questions to if you have them. We will be covering those throughout the presentation, so don't feel like you need to wait until the end to ask those questions. We are going to be having a recording of this. It's already recording right now. We'll be sharing that usually within 2 to 3 days after the webinar. So please check your inbox, check your spam. If you don't get that in 2 to 3 days, feel free to message us and we'll make sure that we get that out to you. With some of the housekeeping out of the way, we'll go ahead and get started. I'm Nolan Hout. I lead our marketing team here at Infopro Learning. Infopro is the sponsor of this webinar, and we're a full-service learning and development partner. Been in the space for just about 30 years or so. Really doing it all, a full-service provider, helping you accomplish any project or any goal you might have when it comes to unlocking the potential of your people. A little shameless plug, Brandon Hall Awards were just announced a couple weeks back, and we won 42 awards as one of our highest earnings ever. Very proud of that accomplishment. So wanted to give that. Today we have joining us is Dan Rust. Dan is a best-selling author and speaker focusing on workplace culture and leadership development. He's the vice president here at Infopro Learning of Global Leadership and Development, and he has a team of researchers, developers, and instructional designers who focus exclusively on that leadership space. Dan's been in this field and really has great perspective from various different types of industries, working in different types of organizations. And I'm very excited to pass this over to Dan, who's going to take us through the course of this webinar. And again, those that are joining late, I want to remind you, we are going to be recording this webinar and sending it to you. And please encourage you to use your chat, use the Q&A. I'll be here to help moderate and take us through. All right, Dan, over to you.
Excellent. Thank you, Nolan. Just quick session etiquette. And Devesh, I do have a question for you because it was posted in the chat. Someone asked about audio. If I remember correctly, if someone does want to speak and share a question, either they can unmute themselves or we can unmute them. Can you share with us that protocol? Primarily because of the numbers of people that we have, it's primarily going to be, hey, if you have commentary, share the commentary via chat, and we'll watch for that commentary. And if you ask a particularly cogent question or make a particularly profound comment or observation, or are just particularly humorous in any of those cases, we will respond to your chat. And there will be a few discussions. There'll be primarily chat discussions, and we'd love for you to participate in those discussions. So with that, Devesh, can I get just a quick answer?
Sorry, Dan, I just put that in there. Yeah, I can unmute anybody that is needed, but let's try to stick with chat best we can.
Yeah, understood. Yes. Just always, every now and then there's just something that needs to be verbalized, and I love people to have that option. So as Nolan said, Dan Rust, head up Infopro's leadership development practice. You can hear more from me and some of my acquaintances at my podcast, leadershipdisruptedpodcast.com. And also you can see my LinkedIn profile if you want to reach out and connect via LinkedIn. The book Workplace Poker, published by HarperCollins. I would call it a modest bestseller in the workplace culture genre. So with that, let's talk about leading people remotely and both the opportunities and the challenges of leading people remotely. And in order to have this conversation, we do have to talk first about a new psychological term. The term is virtual paranoia. And we saw this term starting about, toward the beginning of the pandemic, when you saw a mass of workers shifting into the remote workspace. Up until that point, most remote workers were remote workers by choice. It wasn't the primary option. It wasn't a necessary option. It was something that a minority of workers had either earned or were doing so because of various reasons. But suddenly, with the pandemic, we had a wave of workers globally who became remote workers, not necessarily by choice. Now, many of them over time began to prefer remote work. Not all, but some. But the term virtual paranoia essentially refers to what happens with a remote worker when day in and day out they are interacting with people. They're seeing people. They're having Teams meetings. They're having Zoom meetings. They're connecting with people, but they have a growing sense of uncertainty and paranoia about their work environment, about their work colleagues. It's generally not as extreme as what you see in the visual here. It's just more of a subtle sense of, hey, I'm connected, but I don't feel connected. I'm engaging, but it doesn't feel as engaging. And that paranoia actually is being driven because we all have this desire to belong, to connect with our tribe of people. And in a typical on-site, in-office, in business environment, there are lots of very subtle cues that occur, subtle interactions that occur. Just walking into an office at the beginning of the day and glancing at people, seeing people, nodding, smiling, stopping by somebody's cubicle, ha- sharing a quick joke while you're sipping from your coffee, asking the question, "Hey, how was your weekend?" That there are myriad little micro interactions that occur that were back when we were all in an in-office environment. They almost went unnoticed. In fact, they did go unnoticed for the most part because they were these micro interactions, but it's part of our social fabric, part of our social need to have a work environment where we belong. And so in a remote environment, while you in fact have exposure to probably more people than you had when you were in an in-office environment, maybe not quite this many people, but you have exposure to a lot of people. Um, Something about that exposure, something about the remote environment, the webcam environment, the it doesn't feed the same social desires. And also, we don't have a lot of those micro interactions. We have macro interactions. We have Teams meetings with a purpose. We have conversations with a purpose. Occasionally, we'll have some social light interactions with people, but for the most part, um, everything that we do is with a purpose, and that's certainly nothing wrong with that, except that because we aren't really feeding that social need that humans have, even introverts, even people who tend to work best when they have time, alone in their cave, they still have a need for some degree of social interaction, social validation, social connection. And even introverts, while they may say they feel, really at home in a remote work environment, even they can succumb to this feeling of virtual paranoia because even though you're exposed to so many people, you feel alone. You feel you're not. There's something instinctive that is saying things aren't quite right. This isn't quite giving me what I am used to getting, and so you have this sense of feeling alone, which then feeds into that paranoia. And we also notice that there are generational differences, but the generational differences are somewhat counterintuitive. We actually are finding that millennials and Gen Z succumb more to workplace or to virtual paranoia than baby boomers. Not sure why that is, but we're finding that Gen Z and millennials, these are actually workers who are more accustomed to a remote work environment, but they do tend to, again, have more of those feelings of virtual paranoia over time. So the reason I share this and I start with this is because if you're going to be an effective leader of a remote team, I think you have to start with an understanding that from a pure psychological perspective, your remote team is not operating in exactly the same way that they were operating when they were all together in a workplace environment, in an office environment. And I say this with the experience of over 20 years of working and leading and managing remote teams. Long before the pandemic, I worked for a global organization, and that global organization, my direct report supervisor was in Boston. Her boss was in Connecticut. His boss was somewhere else, and our entire team was linked up and working in different locations. So I bring the perspective of having worked remotely for almost 2 decades, and and I know that working remotely and leading remotely does require a different sense of the people that you're working with, and understanding that the remote experience isn't purely a difference in technology. There is a difference in the psyche of remote workers. So here's an example. Just a quote. Having had lots of conversations with lots of people about their experience with remote work and leading remotely. I've gathered up some of their quotes. And here's just a quote. I'm not going to read through all of it, but essentially, this quote is from an individual who's expressing his discomfort, expressing how this just doesn't necessarily feel the way it used to feel. And he's used to having direct access, direct knowledge. He can walk into a business, could walk into his office location and sort of look out at the sea of people, and he could feel productivity happening. You can, he may have never been conscious of this before, but when you walk in and you hear the computer keys clicking, when you hear the murmur of telephone conversations happening, you hear the rustling of papers. There are all kinds of cues that are telling you work is happening, productivity is happening, stuff is happening. And in a remote environment, you don't get all of those cues, and it makes some leaders uncomfortable, uncertain, and some leaders instinctively want to get, quote, back to the office as rapidly as possible. Doesn't necessarily even matter to them whether their folks are in fact more productive, because some of your employees are in fact likely to be more productive working remotely than they were working in the office. Not all, and we'll talk about how to discern between those employees for whom the remote environment is actually a huge productivity booster, and those employees for whom the remote environment is actually a detriment and is creating challenges, and what you can do about that. But we have here on the screen 6 critical skills of effective virtual team leadership. I'm going to tick through them fairly briefly. I do want to acknowledge that most of the content of this program is curated from a 6-hour program from Infopro Learning called Leading Remote and Hybrid Teams. So in my development of this webinar content for an hour, I had to chop out an awful lot of content. There's a literary phrase called kill your darlings. In order to be a good writer, you can't just pour everything out, onto the paper. You do have to oftentimes kill some of the things you're really in love with in order to make your writing as impactful as possible. And I found that to be true in creating this webinar. I had to kill a lot of darlings to get down to an hour of content. And I think you'll still find that I'm probably a little still too fully packed with content. But 6 critical skills. Number 1, of course, we always know that clear communication of expectations, goals, and timelines was always important. In the remote environment, it's even more important. It's not simply, hey, maintain your communication clarity. It's important to evolve your communication clarity, to understand that, again, back in the office, there were lots of very subtle, unconscious cues regarding timeline expectations. Every now and then you stop by somebody's office and you just lean in and say, hey, how's it going on project X? Or you hear other people talking about project Y, or you notice some activity happening around something. There are lots of unconscious cues that help keep us focused, help keep us moving forward, help keep us tracking with what's most important and most critical. And those are all gone in a remote environment. So it is important that we do much more consciously clarify what are our expectations, what are our goals, what are timelines for specific projects, for specific tasks. Things that could have been simply taken for granted in the past can no longer be taken for granted. It's also important to have a collaborative culture that crosses cultural, organizational, individual boundaries, individual differences. Many of the differences in individual working style, in individual thought processes, were somewhat homogenized in an in-office environment when we're all here together. But that homogenization actually has gone away because, again, of the remote workspace. So you have individual differences becoming much more prevalent, coming to the fore. And as a leader, while it makes it difficult sometimes, it's important to make sure that you're not just assuming, well, this is the way we worked when we were all together. So now we're working the same way. We just happen to be in different physical locations. It's not just the physical location has changed. The actual worker psyche and worker differences have become a little more prevalent in the remote workspace. Um, I'm going to go down the list. We say here prioritize one-on-one engagement with every direct report. In an in-office location, if you happen to miss a one-on-one meeting 1 week, even 2 weeks, no big deal. In fact, what happens is, you stop by somebody's cubicle and say, "Hey, got a lot going on. Do you mind if we bump our one-on-one this week to next week?" Or maybe your one-on-ones actually in a in-office environment, maybe they weren't every week. Maybe you had one-on-ones every 2 weeks or every 3 weeks, which worked just fine in that in-office environment. But if you back up to our what we were saying about virtual paranoia, in a remote environment, I think it is critical that leaders have a weekly one-on-one. Now, again, depending on time constraints, it could just be a 15-minute one-on-one. It could be a 30-minute one-on-one. It could be an hour, depending upon what your time constraints are. But it is important that you connect with every one of your direct reports at least once a week, more frequently if that's possible, but at least once a week, and understand that the goal of that one-on-one connection isn't just a download of progress. It's not just, okay, hey, let's tick through the list. Let's go through the list of priorities. You may want to accomplish a little of that, but understand that the bigger part of these one-on-ones is you're somewhat filling the gap of the lack of all the other, social cues and interactions that are happening throughout the week. So it is important to ask people, how are you doing? How are things going? And not from the standpoint of, hey, I'm looking for problems or assuming that there are problems, but checking in with how people are spending their time, going a little further than you might have in the past to share more about your own personal life and find out more about their personal lives. And um, so this sometimes comes very naturally to some leaders, and it does not come naturally to other leaders. And the point I just want to share here is, if you're going to evolve into a highly effective remote leader, you are, in all likelihood, going to have to evolve toward having a little more attention being paid to the human connections you have with your direct reports. Because the human connections that would have occurred very naturally in an on-site environment, they will degrade, they will erode over time if you aren't more proactive in making those connections. And also getting feedback as a leader, back to remote or virtual paranoia. It is even harder for employees to share challenging points of view, if they disagree with the decision that you've made, if there's something that you're doing or have done that in a live environment, they might have sort of, stopped by your office and said, hey, could we talk just a bit about whatever. Um, in a remote environment, it's much less likely that those kinds of informal conversations are going to happen. So you are going to have to go out of your way to ask them, how am I doing? What did you think of? How do you respond to what we discussed in that previous meeting? You are going to have to draw them in because again, there will be less comfort in them overtly expressing particularly challenging thoughts or challenging opinions. So again, the point of what you see here in terms of these 6 critical skills is that in many ways, remote leadership just requires you to be a little bit better in all of the ways you had to be good anyway on site. So there are some differences, some things that are specifically different, but to a large degree, to be an effective remote leader, you have to be 100% on your game and doing all of these things that you see on the screen here, just doing them a little bit better, sometimes a lot better than you might have been doing in the past. The one of the points that we make on the list here, you see establish and clearly communicate virtual team norms. What we mean by norms is the unspoken expectations. Sometimes they're spoken, but the expectations of how we operate in an office environment. When you go to work in an office environment the first time, within a week or two, you very quickly figure out what the norms are. When do people show up? When do people leave? When do people take a break for lunch? What are all of the other norms and activities? Who's really busy and overwhelmed, and who should I leave alone for a while? Who's got time and capacity to work on something? Who when they head into the break room and they see someone else, who tends to take time to have a little chit chat in the break room, and who is all business and just comes in, fills up their coffee mug, and then heads out. Lots and lots of norms in terms of the behavior of that group become obvious to us in a live environment. In a remote environment, you have to be overt about all of those norms. Simple things, even, if you're a manager and you like working on Saturday mornings, and you tend to send out emails to your team on Saturday mornings, unless you say to them specifically, hey, I like to work Saturday mornings. I certainly don't expect anyone to work Saturday mornings unless that's also something that you want to do. If you happen to get a request from me or an email from me in off hours, there is no expectation that you're going to respond immediately unless, again, there's no prohibition. If you want to, you certainly can, but there's no expectation if it's outside of what we've agreed are our normal working hours. If you don't say those words, then there are uncertainties. Like, what am I supposed to do if he's or she's emailing me on a Tuesday night, or pinging me via Teams or Zoom chat on some off after hours timeline? Am I expect what are the expectations? Those are that, and that's just one example of overtly communicating norms. So in the chat, if any of you have taken the time to overtly communicate to your team some specific norm or set of norms so that the team can really relax a bit and understand, okay, this is how we are working together, this is how we will work together as a team. And I'll give you a few more examples while we're waiting to see if any commentary comes through the chat. I spoke with a leader about a week ago. She said that she has developed for herself a particular cadence of work, and that cadence includes, she has a 10-hour span of her workday. She starts at 8, she ends at about 8 a.m., she ends at about 6 p.m. But she said in that 10-hour workday, she also gives herself a long 90-minute to 2-hour break in the middle of the day. And she said that 90-minute to 2-hour break is important because she gets a couple of things done for her family, with her family. So she's had to let her team know, if you look on her Outlook calendar, there's a block every day for 90 minutes. If you try to get a hold of her during that 90 minutes, she's not available, and she feels good about it. And she asked her direct reports to also communicate their norms. So she said, I'm not asking all of you to have my cadence or my norm, but let's all let each other know what are our typical work hours. And if any of you is, for example, taking 45 minutes off during your mid-morning in order to take your kids to school or do whatever, let's just be open about that. Let us know what your timeline expectation is for work. And so then we can all work within that. And nobody has to feel like they are, secretly running errands or secretly doing whatever. I see a commentary from Sean. There's an expectation in our department and in most of the organization to have cameras on during meetings, which is great. We're going to talk about the power of leveraging the webcam, and how important it is that leaders truly lead. If your leaders establish whatever words are used, if the leaders establish norm is webcams are optional, or if the leader is basically kind of in and out of webcams, everyone picks up on that. So that becomes the reality of the norm. And in fact, here's a quote from someone I spoke with a month or so ago. He said, I use my webcam when meeting with clients and prospects, but not all the time for every meeting with reps and colleagues. Webcam fatigue is a real thing, and sometimes I need to be able to multitask during remote meetings, and the webcam makes that awkward. Now, I wouldn't say that as a wrong point of view. However, I wouldn't call it optimal either. In fact, whenever I hear leaders, because I do think to lead remotely, you have to maximize the use of your webcam. And it's important, and we'll talk in a minute about what we call virtual hygiene. Like, how do you maximize the use of the webcam? But if you're giving yourself the out, if you're giving yourself the, hey, if I need to multitask or if I need to whatever, and you end up developing a habit of sometimes on, sometimes off, you will oftentimes drift to more times off than on, and it gets noticed and it gets modeled by your employees. So I had a leader say to me, he was complaining about webcam fatigue. He just said, "Look, I've been on web meetings for the last 4 hours, and it's just exhausting. So, hey, I'm going to turn my camera off for this meeting." And what it actually reminded me of was a very quick scene from the movie Mission Impossible. I forget which Mission Impossible this was, but this is now, and I'll be honest, I didn't say this to him directly. This is just the movie that played in my mind. I've got a little 20-second clip to play for you. So here we go.
This scenario is precisely why the IMF exists.
The IMF is Halloween, Alan. A bunch of grown men in rubber masks playing trick-or-treat. And if he had held on to the plutonium in Berlin, we wouldn't be having this conversation.
And his team would be dead.
Yes, they would. That's the job.
There we go. So that comment, that's the job. Remote leadership in its own ways is harder than on-site leadership. It just is harder. You have to do more to connect with people. You have to do more to manage your own mental and emotional energy. The truth is, you succumb to virtual paranoia just like everybody else. And the virtual paranoia that you succumb to may cause you to want to be more controlling, more monitoring. And that may be appropriate for some of your employees, but it's important to notice your own virtual paranoia if it's beginning to sink in and affect some of your behavior and activities. So here are some advantages of turning your webcam on. I am an advocate. The people that work for me, like Nolan, or work with me, like Nolan and Devesh, they know I am a camera always on guy. And here is the best reason to have a camera always on mentality. It forces me every morning to get up early, take a shower, wash up, groom up, and be webcam ready at the very beginning of the day. And it's not just about being webcam ready, because I know that in those times when I've allowed myself to drift away from that standard, it's real easy to, hey, set your alarm for 5 minutes before your first meeting. You get your alarm. Oh, you got 5 minutes left. You snooze for 2 minutes. You got 3 minutes left. You snooze for another 2 minutes. You got 1 minute left. You roll out of bed, roll into your first meeting, make sure your webcam is off, and you can pretend, you're there, you can say words, you can pretend, but you're obviously not going to be at your best just rolling out of bed. And I also think you're probably not at your best if on some level you're in your pajamas, or you're wearing a wrinkled t-shirt, or your hair is all matted up, or you haven't brushed your teeth. There's something about the process of getting up, grooming, getting ready. When we had to go into work in an on-site environment, we were forced into a process. We were forced into not just the commute to work, but for many of us, it was a 45-minute to hour and a half process that got our minds ready to walk into the workplace. And I think to a large degree, having that time as you're driving into the office and you're thinking about what's coming up and you're thinking about meetings, you end up operating much more effectively as a leader than if you simply roll out of bed and step into a web meeting without the camera on. Now, when it comes to having the camera on, um, without
Dan,
overdoing this,
sorry to interrupt. I
sure.
have a question on this actually, and I apologize to everybody else who probably has better questions. But this is a question from the host. I grew up seeing my dad pace around with his phone up against his head, and I myself find myself urging to get up and pace around once I'm in my sixth hour of a Teams call in a day, to get up and move. And there's a lot of studies that show as you're moving and talking, it helps you think better. How do you balance the two of those, of being on camera versus not being behind your desk for another hour and getting some of that energy out?
I don't necessarily think you have to balance it at all. You can buy a standing desk. You can establish the norms with your team. You can say, "Hey, I'm on camera. I'm going to be
Walking around.
walking back and forth a bit." And of course, if you are particularly antsy at the end, when you say, "Hey, I've been on camera for 6 hours. I've been back-to-back meetings for 6 hours." There might be an issue with that as well. And we'll talk about managing your mental and emotional energy, because in any environment, if you are on for 6 hours, you're not going to be optimal whether your webcam is on or off. So it's a fair point. But Grasjana says standing desks are the best. And the best gift that was ever given to me was a standing desk with an electronic button where I can press a button and it rises, and press another button and it lowers, so I don't have to turn a crank or anything. It is the coolest thing ever, to be able to stand and sit almost at will. But when it comes to, as a leader, your on-screen behavior, the energy that you used to project in a live environment. Let's say on a scale of 1 to 10, with 10 being energetic, enthusiastic, passionate, and 1 being comatose or close to it. If you're used to being a 9 or a 10 and people are expecting a 9 or a 10, in order for that 9 or 10 to come through in a web environment, you probably have to dial it up to 11 or a 12. There is a degradation of energy that comes through. It's like right now, I got all this passion for this topic that has to come through in this little screen and somehow get to all of you. So if I'm going to maximize my webcam environment, I'm going to use my body language, which means I am going to move around a bit. Now I'm limited to this frame of what my movement is. I am going to use hand gestures. I am going to make eye contact. In fact, I invested in there's a camera called a center cam, which actually drops the camera down to the center of your screen, so that when you're looking at your screen, it gives the impression you're looking directly into the camera, and you're looking directly at the person. It's a little thing, but if you are, again, really trying to fine tune your leadership of a remote team, all of these little things add up. And they're relatively inexpensive. The truth is, even here, I have this microphone here that is actually it's a very high quality microphone, and it is designed to ensure that what comes through to the people that I work with is very crisp, clear audio. And I find that now I have to readjust it. What I find is that when I happen to be traveling and suddenly they have to hear me just on my laptop microphone, or they have to see me just through my laptop webcam, it's noticeable. I mean, people ask, they say, "So, hey, what's wrong with your system?" Because they notice the degradation. All of those little things do matter, and they matter more so than they did in an on-site environment. And so I would just say pay attention to the little things as to optimize your impact as a remote leader. Back to the topic of virtual paranoia. Uh, it is important as a remote leader to balance trust and control. The more paranoid you start to feel about, hey, who's working, who's not, who's productive, who isn't, what are they doing, what are they not doing, your instinct will be to latch on and grab control, or to check in, to ping people. I had this goes back about a decade. When I was working in a remote environment, and I had a remote leader, and she had this habit of just checking in. And the reason it became noticeable to me is her checking in never had any substance to it. She just wanted to know, hey, are you there? Are you working? Are you? But she didn't really try hard to fake it. And after a while, it became increasingly frustrating or annoying because I was highly productive, and our basic advice would be hire people who you trust, watch closely. When people earn the right for free, to have freedom, if someone is producing, if someone is generating, if someone is achieving what they need to achieve, give them more and more autonomy, give them more and more freedom. But don't assume that everyone operates effectively that way. I spoke with a leader a couple of weeks ago. She said what she was surprised by was one of her star employees in an on-site environment, star employee, was suddenly, after 6 months working remotely, was not producing the same quality, was not as productive, was not, in fact, really was degrading in terms of effectiveness. Now, this organization had gone to fully remote, so there wasn't an option to pull this employee into an office. And the manager that I spoke with said that she had a difficult conversation. The employee, kind of briefly redoubled her efforts, but within a few months there was this degradation again. And what she ultimately came to determine was that this was a particular person who kind of needed the daily nudging, the daily subtle nudging of, hey, I'm in an office with a bunch of other people, everybody's working, so I'm going to work, everybody's doing, so I'm going to do. This was a particular employee who actually just didn't have, at this point in her life, the you might call it maturity, you might call it work ethic, just did not have the capability of truly being autonomous. And unfortunately for this employee, that became a deal breaker, because the manager said, I actually can't handhold any of our employees just because of the nature of our business. Now, this statement from this manager, we hire great people, then it's up to them. They either sink or swim in this business. I'm not sharing this as an example of a best practice. I think the best practice is to hire people, put them to work, observe carefully, and know that autonomy is earned. Mindless autonomy is abandonment. So I view this as abandonment. So we're not talking about mindless autonomy. We're talking about intentional autonomy, giving people rope, letting them work with the rope that you give them. And then some people are going to flourish in that environment. In fact, most of the research tells us that more employees than not will flourish in a remote environment if they're given clear expectations, a clear understanding of timelines, goals, objectives. What is your role? What are you accountable for? And then they're given the freedom to achieve that. It's one of the reasons why Apple, for example, Apple has a huge hustle culture. Apple has a huge work hard culture. But for most Apple employees, there is this sense that, yes, it's a hustle culture, it's a hard work culture, but I have the freedom to figure out what hard work looks like for me. And having that freedom, having that autonomy to figure out the how actually makes the hard work culture much more palatable, as opposed to not only do we have to work hard, but the hours are defined for us, the how is defined for us. That becomes a constraint, that becomes a workplace prison. So when it comes to remote leadership, and you're gonna hear me tying back to virtual paranoia again and again, because I do think that is one of the core things underlying the difference between working remotely and working on site. Is there's a psychological difference in those two experiences. And so when it comes to performance conversations in the on-site world, uh, without even thinking about it, there were lots of little micro opportunities to say, hey, good job on that. Hey, I really liked that slide deck that you shared earlier today. Hey, that was cool, the idea that you shared. All of those little micro things occur without us even really thinking much about them. Lots of positive performance, not necessarily conversations, positive performance notices, commentary. And so, um, in a remote environment, we have to be a bit more conscious of what's happening in terms of our performance conversations. And if the only time you have a substantive performance conversation is once a year during your annual performance reviews, or maybe your quarterly performance reviews, however your organization does it, it's critical that in between those formal conversations, that you have lots of informal positive performance conversations, those weekly one-on-one connects that we talked about, or other opportunities. You want to fill as much positive commentary as possible into those conversations, so that when the time does come where you're going to ask to have a more challenging performance conversation, when that time comes, you want that to happen within the context of, hey, we've had lots of positive dialogue about what you're doing well, what your skills are, what your capabilities are, what your unique strengths are. We've had lots of those conversations. So now when I need to address something that's a bit challenging, maybe a bit corrective, within that context, it's much more palatable for a remote worker. Whereas if what they experience is silence, not much in terms of positivity, and then suddenly you say to them, "Hey, I've got something challenging that we need to talk about." It's going to have much more weight, and that paranoid mind is going to make a lot more of it than perhaps should be made of it. And I totally agree with you, Sean. Year-end conversations should never come as a surprise. In fact, a year-end conversation should feel like, well, this is sort of the formalization of what we've already been talking about. But we do want to make note of the progress that's been made. We want to make note of the work that's in progress. So this is sort of the formality, but what we're talking about should never come as a surprise. Absolutely. And my point is, it's even more critical in a remote environment than necessarily in an on-site face-to-face environment. I had someone say to me yesterday, actually, hey, psychological safety is not just the leader's job. Psychological safety is everybody's job. Yes, it is. Of course, all teammates, all colleagues, we can all do more to help each other in terms of creating more psychological safety. And with that said, it is the leader who actually has the greatest control over the sense of psychological safety that a team has, because it's the leader who has the power. It's the leader who has the hammer, so to speak. So while it may not be fair that this is placed on top of you, I had someone say to me, "Oh, man, I still have all the pressures that I used to have. I'm still expected to produce the results that I used to produce. I'm still expected to perform, and I'm still expected to deliver. And now I have to do it and be empathetic and sensitive. And I have to know my people better. I have to care about them more. I have to create a culture of psychological safety." It just feels like too much. This came from this one person, and back to my Mission Impossible video, my response to him was, "Yeah, that is the job. It's harder. It is harder. Let's acknowledge that it is harder. I'll even give you a bit of empathy in terms of why it's harder. But in the end, it is a responsibility of leaders. So I'm going to I'm going to advance my slide to because as I said at the beginning, I probably packed more into this presentation as I was sampling content from our Leading Remote and Hybrid Teams program. So I'm going to go to this commentary from a VP of Sales Enablement in Singapore. The quote was, "While I like the flexibility of leading a team remotely, if I'm not careful to establish boundaries, the workflow never seems to stop." And what we have found is the degree to which the leader establishes boundaries for himself or herself essentially gives permission for the team members to establish boundaries for themselves. And if you have a leader with no boundaries, a leader who is on all the time, who is working all the time, a leader who is working 6 hours at a pop, that actually communicates the expectation that, well, I guess that's how we're supposed to do it here, wherever we happen to be. Whereas what we recommend is that you do thoughtfully establish boundaries for yourself as a remote leader. So when we say boundaries, first of all, we talk about physical boundaries. It is important that you think of your space at, I'm going to assume at home for most, but it may be in an offsite location. I know that Nolan, for example, has a shared workspace that he uses. So he's not actually working remotely from home. He's working remotely from a shared workspace. But for many, perhaps most people, it is in fact their home environment. It's important that you think about that as your workspace. Maybe it's a dedicated workspace for a certain period of time. Maybe for 8 hours or 10 hours a day, I'll talk about the extreme. The end of the kitchen table is your workspace for that period of time. Or maybe you, in fact, have a dedicated office or room within your home environment. But it is important to sort of apply your business mindset to that space and structure that space so that you do have physical boundaries. And while so initially it might be cute that whenever you close the door, the dog is scratching at the door because the dog wants in. It might initially be cute. It might be, occasionally stress relieving to have the dog come in or to have the kids come in, and it may even work for you. So I'm not saying, hey, never allow your kids into your remote office environment. But I am saying set physical boundaries that do work for you, take control of those physical boundaries, create separation. And I'll give you one example. This is a situation for me. So I work primarily from home. I have a wife and a son who are at home. And for the most part, I work in my office and everything is fine, except that our coffee machine is in the kitchen. And I like having coffee 2 or 3 times throughout the day. And what I found happening was I would walk out into the kitchen. I would start to pour my cup of coffee, and my wife would make a perfectly reasonable comment, ask a perfectly reasonable question, and we would start to get drawn into a husband-wife conversation that oftentimes became somewhat of a rabbit hole as we go through that. And then I would have to suddenly say, "Oh man, sorry, 30 seconds. I gotta go to the next meeting." And when that started to happen, offense was taken. It's like it felt rude to her, and we had to sit down and have a conversation about the boundaries of space and time, and ultimately come to an agreement that during particular times of day, when I come out to get a cup of coffee, before we get involved in a conversation, at least ask the question, "Hey, do you have 15 minutes to talk about something? Or do you have the mind space to address a particular issue?" And as simple as that is, it made all the difference because we were much more conscious about those boundaries and more conscious about the norms that we had to shift to. So our norms as a family had to shift in response to the remote work environment. And we've already talked about setting time boundaries, scheduling time in your calendar, scheduling your workday, and establishing norms with your team and having them establish norms with you. All of that, having that dialogue with your team will absolutely will change the way you interact with each other, and you will avoid having people feel like they have to secretly take a little time off here or secretly do this there, or try to pretend to do both. Pretend to be responsive while I'm driving my kid to the dentist or whatever. It's perfectly okay in a remote environment to have flexibility and openness. So I'm going to pause for a quick second. I am going to take a sip of coffee. And we're going to talk about health and well-being, because the remote work environment, if you aren't conscious about it, it will degrade your health and well-being. There's a previous slide talking about our remote work commute. Some of you in a on-site work environment developed a cadence where you commute to work in the morning. You might have a gym near where you work, or you have a gym near your house, and you would drive to work or drive to the exercise facility, exercise, and then go into work. Or at the end of the day, after work, you would come back, stop at the exercise facility, and then head home. But you built an exercise routine into your quote commute pattern. And for all of the good intentions of buying exercise equipment and bringing it into the home, and most of the data tells us that at least 70% of in-home exercise equipment goes either mostly or completely unused. Now, that's not to say that having in-home exercise equipment isn't valuable, but you will have to be very conscious and intentional and understand that many of the psychological cues that prompted you to start to exercise have gone away, and you're going to have to create new cues. You may have to create some new intentionality, some new discipline around, okay, it's 5:30, 6 o'clock. I'm wrapping up my at-home workday, and now going downstairs to exercise is not an option. That is part of my consistent routine. You will have to establish a new routine, establish new cues, or it may be in the morning. Again, we're not going to go through all the do's and don'ts of good health, good exercise, good nutrition. The point that I just want to make is that all of those things they're not just as important as they were, they are more important than ever. And in some way, they should be more accessible than ever. You have more freedom, more flexibility. But in fact, I read a survey 2 weeks ago. In fact, remote workers, while they have the freedom to exercise more, they in fact exercise less than they did pre-pandemic. So something is shifting where we have the space, we have the ability, we have the flexibility, but it's not happening as consistently as it used to happen. So I would just ask you to think for a moment about your own health patterns, your eating patterns, your sleeping patterns, your water intake patterns, all the things that you know that you should be doing. Ask yourself, has anything degraded since I began leading remotely? And whatever has degraded, what can you do to bring that not only back to where it was, but even maybe bring it even further? Maybe be even more committed to healthy eating. Maybe be even more committed to the exercise routine that worked for you. So again, I don't want it to go unstated, because to the degree that your energy degrades, it's also going to send cues to your people, and you may find that consciously or not, they take up your patterns of behavior. So you see it on the screen. We all know the right things to do. It's a matter of cueing ourselves to do the things that we know need to be done. So let's talk a bit about mental, social, and emotional well-being. Depending upon the generation that you're in, when somebody mentions mental health days, mental wellness, it may frustrate you. It may not frustrate you. But the fact is, today's workers, are remote workers in particular, are feeling more vulnerable mentally, socially, emotionally. You may remember pre-pandemic, there was a fair amount of research that said one key indicator of an employee's level of engagement is the degree to which they have at least one best friend in the workplace. And you would see that on engagement surveys. One of the questions would be, do you have a best friend at work? And And so it was something we asked ourselves, we asked each other, we knew that it was a key indicator. So I ask you, in this remote environment, now that you've transitioned to a remote leadership environment, do you have a remote best friend? Or just, do you have a workplace best friend? Many of us, for many of us, the answer might be, hey, I used to, but she's not with the business anymore, or he's not with the business anymore, or now that we're both remote, we've kind of drifted apart. We're still colleagues, we still get along, but can't remember the last time we actually went out for a drink, or out bowling, or whatever your friendship looked like before. And so. So Stephen, I see your question, and because I've got just a few minutes, I'm going to address it very briefly. But how do you overcome cultural differences when you facilitate meetings via remote for your team? Now, it depends on what the cultural differences are. But let's just take one, for example. I've got a team of about a third of them are clearly neurodiverse. You might call them introverts. They're engineers. They're very logical in their thought patterns, and they tend to not speak up. And then I've got other team members who are trainers, facilitators, who love hearing the sound of their own voice. And yet I know I need to draw out the engineering types, and I need more sharing from them. I need them to feel more comfortable. So it's, first of all, recognizing that particular difference. And if it's a cultural difference, again, depending upon the cultures that we're talking about, some cultures are more comfortable with overt sharing in meetings. Some cultures are a little more cautious and careful. And those cultures that are more cautious and careful, that tends to get accentuated in a remote environment. So what I have done is I've reached out one-on-one to each of my individual direct reports, including those who are more verbal, more outgoing, more comfortable sharing their thoughts, etc. And with all of them, I've had the conversation that we want to make sure we're creating a space for those who may be less overt in sharing. So I've also said that to my engineering types. I've said, we need to hear from you. We need your perspective. We need your points of view sometimes. So I'm going to ask you to sometimes step into that natural tension that you're feeling, that discomfort you're feeling. And then what I say to the more verbal types is, I'm going to ask you to self-regulate and occasionally not just jump in. Even when I ask, does anyone have any thoughts, ideas, any perspectives on this? Maybe press the pause button. Give a bit of space to see if any of the less comfortable folks will step in. And that's just one little simple example, but it starts by recognizing what is the cultural variation, and then having the conversations with those individuals, so that at least we're overt in talking through what sort of normative behaviors are we hoping for. Um, Obviously, you don't have time to go into much more detail about that. But if you follow up, we've got some other content on specific cultural variations. So, um, mental, social, emotional well-being. Um, Honestly, this is an area where many leaders in the past just have not been comfortable even stepping into, where you've said, look, I manage tasks, I manage objectives and key results, I manage the stuff that needs to get done, I manage processes. I don't want to manage emotions, I don't want to manage mental health. And we're not asking you to manage mental health, we're asking you to be aware of mental health issues and actually create a space where employees are comfortable having those conversations, as uncomfortable as it may be for you. And it's not that you have to be a counselor or a therapist. We're not recommending that at all. But we are saying that the job of a remote leader is more than just managing objectives, tasks, key results. The job of a remote leader is more than just managing the activities of people. It is partly managing the psyches, the emotions, the full humans that you are working with. Um, the good news is, and I want to be respectful of everyone's time, so we were going to end this exactly on time. But the good news is, if you can master this, it makes you a profoundly better leader in general, not just a remote leader, makes you a profoundly better leader when you learn to actually lead the full humans who are reporting to you, not just their arms and legs that are doing tasks. Last two things is we have an upcoming webinar in 30 days. You can see, obviously, I have a fair amount of additional content. Yes, I did not kill enough of my darlings as I was putting this together. But we have a webinar coming up in about 30 days called Is Artificial Intelligence Fostering Genuine Ignorance? The essence of the webinar is there is a downside. There is, you might call it a dark side. There is a cautionary tale related to artificial intelligence that I think every leader should probably think through. And we'll be sending you information on this upcoming webinar. And also, we'll be following up with this material so that you can actually have these slides in PDF form. So with that, we're exactly at 11 o'clock. Sorry to have to cut it short, but I want to be respectful of everybody's time. So thank you very much. Really appreciate your paying attention and your engagement in the chat throughout this, and hope to see you again, engage with you again on a future webinar. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, everybody, for joining. There are some contact details there. I also put mine in the chat if anybody would like a specific question or even to arrange a call with Dan. I can try to arrange that on a particular need. Again, dropping my email in there. You can also use the one posted here. Thank you all for joining. Again, if you love this one, be on the lookout. We're going to send you details in about 30 days for the next one. Thanks, everybody, for sticking around. Look for the recording to hit your inbox in a couple days. Thank you again, everyone. I look forward to seeing you on the next one. Good one.